Let's go back to Ray Hadley, live from 2GB this morning. Ray Hadley, you brought the breaking news to us this morning that this bill may not be going ahead now. Why? What do you know?
Pretty simple. The Premier has directed that it will be a show of hands, not a secret ballot. Now, there'd be many people, we're talking about somewhere between 10 and 15 who are prepared to put their secret ballot in, but they won't be prepared to put their hand up because it could cost them a ministry. If you know what I mean.
Yep.
There are ministers who oppose the Premier at every opportunity here. Many, like Mr Speakman, don't. But because the Premier has now said it's a show of hands, they can only guarantee 4 hands will go up, and that would be the 3 proponents of the spill last night, plus Kevin Connolly. But it doesn't end there, because if by the close of business today, this abortion bill passes the upper house with no amendments, despite what the Attorney-General just said, I'd expect both Tanya Davies, in fact, they'd have to resign from the government and go to the crossbenchers. Both Kevin Connolly, who's not part of this spill but has been very vocal in his condemnation of the bill, both he and Tanya Davies in the lower house would go to the crossbenchers sometime in the foreseeable future, giving the government only 46. They need 47 to govern in their own right. Now, they don't have control of the upper house to start with. There are 11 crossbenchers there in any case. So they have a problem in the upper house. But if they were to only have 46 in the lower house, despite the protestations of the Attorney-General, this could be, terminal for the Premier. And she's playing the political game. She knows that by making it a show of hands, not a secret ballot, that puts pressure on people within her cabinet to not put their hands up, because self-preservation law takes over. They want to stay in the ministry. And if they were to put their hand up, they'd be sacked immediately from cabinet. So they won't be doing that. So she's called their bluff. She said it'll be a show of hands, not a secret ballot, as they had called for. So as a result, I'm expecting that they will call off the spill in the next hour. But then, once this does pass the upper house, as we think it will without amendments, once that happens, I expect both Tanya Davies and Kevin Connolly to resign from the government and go to the crossbenchers, giving the Premier a headache that she doesn't need. Really
interesting. Mark Speakman was just telling me there on the news from you that I broke to him via you, of course, that this bill would be brought off. He said he welcomed that news, and he also made it clear that he doesn't think these MPs have to resign from the party. But is it your understanding that they will anyway?
Yeah, well, look, the Premier can't have people who have brought a spill motion against her sitting on the same side of the chamber. You can't have it. It just doesn't work like that. And Mark Speakman knows that. He's a seasoned politician, but he obviously at the moment is trying, he talks about infrastructure and the wonderful things that have happened in New South Wales, so that he tries to deflect away from where we are at the moment. But the simple fact of the matter is, and I do dispute the fact that he keeps talking about it being not a government bill, standing alongside Alex Greenwich when this was out of the blue was Brad Hazzard. And Brad Hazzard was seen, glad-handing and high-fiving members of the opposition and the Greens when it went through the lower house. It's always been a government bill. Mr Greenwich obviously has been promised certain things via the Greens, the government, because he is the fall guy. He's gone there and he honestly believes in what he's proposed, obviously. But at the end of the day, of course it's a government bill. It's a government bill by proxy. They didn't mention it before the election. They didn't go anywhere near it. They didn't say one of the platforms that you'll elect us on, we will go to the chamber and we'll bring on a debate about an abortion bill. They didn't mention it. The first time they mentioned it was when Alex Greenwich stood up and out the back of Parliament in the Domain and said, oh, by the way, this is what we're doing, with Hazzard standing alongside him. I mean, so you can't in any way, shape or form distance the government from this bill. I'll tell you what, Laura, they weren't courageous enough to do it themselves, so they said to Alex, oh, mate, look, you do it because you really believe in it, but I'll tell you what, we'll support you. And, that doesn't work with people of the party or the members of the public. And I would remind everyone there were 10,000 people in Sydney on Sunday, pro-lifers. That's a lot of people to gather it, and be addressed by Tony Abbott and Barnaby Joyce about such a matter. So it's a much more important matter, and I speak as someone who supports a woman's right to determine her own future in relation to a pregnancy. I support that right. However, it's got to be done in a manner that's acceptable to the majority of people. And the way it's been done by the government, this sort of secret deal with Greenwich and the rest of it doesn't sit well with anyone, particularly, obviously, with Kevin Connolly and Tanya Davies.
Two things to say about this. Whilst I think it's crazy that the Liberal MPs in New South Wales have not learned from their federal counterparts and how this has rolled out in a federal sphere over the last decade, shows that politicians are pretty slow learners at times. But the argument from Mark Speakman just a couple of minutes ago that this is not in the government's hands, that this is a conscience vote, the government has no control over it, just exposes them. For a government to admit that they don't have control over legislation, I think is a pretty bad look and pretty terminal as well. To say, yeah, look, I get that it's a conscience issue. You can't direct people how to vote. That argument is accepted. But the argument that the government can do nothing to control some of the amendments, either within this legislation or outside of it. I don't know the technical details, but for a government to admit that they can't protect late-term abortions up to 22 weeks, it's crazy.
The government is the mother and father of the abortion bill. They want to blame Alice Greenwich, but they're the mother and father of it. They have ownership of this bill, and they might want to distance themselves from it and talk about the things that Mr Speakman spoke about. But at the end of the day, they didn't have the ticker, they didn't have the courage to go to the electorate before the election and say, we wanted to have a discussion about abortion, and had they done that and won the election, we wouldn't be where we are today.